Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Susan Check-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. Thank you. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. One of FFRPL's most popular programs, Books Sandwiched In, or BSI, has been running continuously since 1956, and we are glad to host everyone here today for our first fall review in the series. A bit of housekeeping, please note the order of the last two programs has been changed from what was originally printed in the brochure. The changes have been noted on our website and on all registration links and posts. We do ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. We will post the live stream event to the RPL YouTube channel at Rochester Public Library, New York. To access the induction loop in the auditorium, you set your hearing aid to the T switch. Central Library's Art of the Book and Paper is now on view in the Anthony Mascioli Gallery across the street on the main level of the Rundell Building in Harold Hacker Hall. FFRPL is a founding sponsor of the Art of the Book exhibit, and we've supported it since the first show in 2011, which was held in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Rochester Public Library. And the exhibit has grown to include work from all over the world. The 2023 show is our most extensive to date. There are 145 artist books, 29 altered books, and 18 paper sculptures on view, submitted by 99 artists. The artwork came from 27 states in the US and from 9 other countries: Argentina, Scotland, Canada, Chile, Brazil, Hong Kong, China, France, the Netherlands, and Mexico. And in other news, the Lincoln Branch Library and the Toy Library now have new furniture, fixtures, and equipment in a completely redesigned and renovated building. The newly created space will improve the quality of life for patrons in the Joseph Avenue D area, and FFRPL thanks the many donors who have supported Lincoln and the Toy Library for helping to make the renovation possible. Today, Gregory Ferran will review Shakespeare Was a Woman by Elizabeth Winkler. Ferran is Professor of English and Chairperson of the English and Communications Department at Nazareth University. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, New York Times bestselling author of The Body Keeps Score, says Elizabeth Winkler's Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies is one of the most engaging, riveting, scholarly, and challenging whodunits anyone with an interest in theater, human psychology, literature, and history can hope to read. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ferran to our podium.
Hi, thanks for being here. Thanks, Diana and Susan, for welcoming me here. I'm happy to be here. In June of 2019, Elizabeth Winkler, a journalist, published in The Atlantic an article called Was Shakespeare a Woman? And in the article, she makes the case for Emilia Bassano as the true author of the plays that have come down to us as being by Shakespeare. Bassano was a member of a family of Italian musicians who had emigrated to London to serve the Tudor monarchs. She was also one of the first women to publish a book of poems in English. Winkler's article inspired a pretty strong response, a lot of it negative, from academic Shakespeareans. Evidently, it also inspired some pretty nasty Twitter comments. And Winkler was surprised by the negative reaction. She wondered why such a strong response to her argument. And that inspired her to write the book we'll discuss today, 2023's Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies, How Doubting the Bard Became the Biggest Taboo in Literature. So in my talk today, I'm going to summarize for you the 11 chapters of the book. I'll give an overview of what I take to be its strengths and weaknesses, and I'll also lay out for you what I think is the crux of the difference between Orthodox Shakespeareans and their skeptics. So, chapter 1 sets the tone for the whole book. Winkler depicts mainstream Shakespearean scholars as a jealous priesthood who are controlling access to the highest god of English literature and who cannot abide the heresy of doubt. Winkler says that there can be no recognition of ambiguities or uncertainties in our construction of the past. There is only adherence to the belief, which operates like a kind of religious fundamentalism. I've chosen a picture for this slide. This appears in Winkler's book at a later chapter. It's by George Romney in the late 18th century, and it depicts the baby Shakespeare in a kind of secular nativity scene. And so it's a nice image of the kind of religiosity that Winkler is aiming at and trying to deflate in this book. Chapter 2 looks at some of the gaps and puzzles in William Shakespeare of Stratford's biography. For example, we have no direct evidence that he was educated. We have no letters or diaries that address themselves to his creative life. Instead, we have documents recording what Winkler says are banal business matters. That culminates in what she says is an embarrassing will devoid of literary interests. There's a shot of Shakespeare's Will's will. Shakespeare, or the author of the plays, was evidently well-versed in foreign languages and geography, but it doesn't appear that William Shakespeare of Stratford ever left England. And even the six signatures we have in Shakespeare's own hand, and you can maybe barely see one of them right here, suggest to some readers inexperience using a pen. Not very good handwriting. So if Shakespeare of Stratford was not the writer, then someone using that name as a pseudonym must have been. And so in chapter 3, Winkler presents some of the doubters' evidence that Shakespeare was, in fact, a pen name. She surveys some late 16th century writers who seem to be referring to a hidden poet. One of those is John Hall in the lines on the screen here. Long as the crafty cuttle, squid or octopus, cuttlefish, lieth sure in the black cloud of his thick vomiture, who dares to complain of wronged faith or fame when he may shift it on to another's name? There was a tradition of pseudonymous publication in the Renaissance. And in some of these passages that Winkler provides, I think you kind of need to squint a little to see them as references to Shakespeare himself. And Winkler admits almost as much when she says that these are literary texts capable of multiple possible meanings. Nevertheless, she goes on to analyze a couple of Shakespeare's sonnets and finds in them some evidence that the author seems to have expected his true identity to die with him. Chapter 4 looks at the first folio of 1623. This is the first collected volume of Shakespeare's works. It appeared 7 years after his death. It was put together by some of his friends and associates. At least that's how the standard story goes. It's usually taken to be pretty definitive proof of the authorship of William Shakespeare of Stratford. Winkler reviews some of the arguments that a lot of the prefatory letters and poems that appear in the beginning of the volume hint at a hidden identity. And as far as Martin Droshout's engraving, the picture of Shakespeare on the front cover, Winkler points out that it is so badly done and so bare of the usual symbols of literary greatness that it must be intended to point us away from William of Stratford. This is a poem on the side is by Ben Jonson, a fellow playwright and a sort of friend and rival of Shakespeare's. In the poem, he seems to suggest that the picture is pretty good. but that it can't capture the poet's mind, and that for that you have to look at the text itself. I don't know if Johnson didn't see the picture before he wrote the poem, or if he thought the picture was actually a pretty good likeness. It may well be. Chapter 5 looks at the rise of the cult of Shakespeare in the 18th and 19th centuries. So by this time, Shakespeare is now Britain's national poet. He's proof of British cultural superiority. And so he deserved a proper biography. But the would-be biographers were having trouble with a relative lack of documentary evidence, especially related to his writing life. And the result was a vacuum of information that encouraged forgeries and highly fictionalized biographies. And Winkler finds a similar kind of myth-making at work when she visits the Shakespeare Birthplace Museum. She travels to Stratford. There it is on screen. She visits Holy Trinity Church in Stratford and sees Shakespeare's funerary monument, the statue on the lower right. She reviews the anti-Stratfordian theory that the bust itself is a forgery and that the real author is buried somewhere in Westminster Abbey. Chapter 6 takes us deeper into the 19th century and the rise of academic literary study as a university discipline, which Winkler presents as a kind of a substitute religion that was designed to quell social discontent among working people, among women, among Britain's colonial subjects, all of whom would be clamoring for their rights. Here's literature instead. Occupy yourself with the great truths of humankind rather than worrying about what you're making in your salary or whether you're allowed to vote. The new god of this religion would have been Shakespeare. And like any religion, it would spawn heretics. The first of these was an American woman, Delia Bacon, who believed that the plays were written by a group of aristocrats led by the philosopher and the politician Sir Francis Bacon, and that the plays were a vehicle to protest royal tyranny in a way that would not endanger the lives of these aristocrats who were at the core of this resistance. The chapter concludes with an interview by Winkler with Sir Stanley Wells, a nonagenarian Shakespeare scholar. He's the honorary president of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Long list of publications to his name. He comes across in Winkler's interview with him as confused and sort of irritated by the entire authorship question. And Winkler concludes that Wells is an aging knight who has fought for the faith for so long that he's now psychologically incapable of doubt. Chapter 7 looks at the theory that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was Shakespeare. This was first argued by John Thomas Loney in 1920. Loney's theory was that because there was a stigma against aristocrats publishing literary works under their own name, it was seen as beneath the dignity of a nobleman, that therefore de Vere would have wanted to publish with a pseudonym, that he enlisted Shakespeare somehow to serve as his frontman. The theory gained new life in the 1980s when U.S. State Department official Charlton Ogburn arranged for there to be a moot court trial of Shakespeare. He enlisted 3 Supreme Court justices, William Brennan Jr., Harry Blackmun, and John Paul Stevens. The 3 justices ruled in favor of William of Stratford, but Blackmun and Stevens later changed their minds. And we'll see Stevens again in this presentation. Chapter 8 looks at the most energetic current proponent of the de Vere Earl of Oxford theory. That's Alexander Waugh. Waugh is the grandson of Evelyn Waugh, the great novelist who wrote Brideshead Revisited, among others. And he's a charismatic, kind of hot-tempered guy. He seems to love antagonizing Orthodox Shakespeareans. They generally refuse to debate with him, although that's not always true. Among his discoveries, so-called, is an anagrammatic reference to the Earl that occurs in a text by William Covell in 1595, Polymanteia. So what's going on here is that at this point in the text, Covell he's reviewing famous writers who come from the universities, Oxford and Cambridge, and that Oxford should be proud to be the alma mater of Samuel Daniel, one of the period's writers. Oxford University, thou mayst extol thy court dear verse, happy Daniel, Samuel Daniel. There's an odd marginal note to Sweet Shakespeare nearby, and the oddity of court dear verse, Waugh says that's an anagram. It's an anagram for our de vere, a secret. So for Waugh, the proximity of Oxford, the anagram, and Shakespeare's name is proof that this is a clue to the true identity. Chapter 9, this is the theory that gives the book its title, and that was at the heart of Winkler's 2019 Atlantic article, that Shakespeare was a woman. She first makes the case for Mary Sidney, the talented sister of Sir Philip Sidney, one of the great poets of the time, and then for Emilia Bassano, whom we've met already. She moves into a discussion of Virginia Woolf's famous essay, A Room of One's Own. This is the essay where Woolf imagines that if Shakespeare had had a sister of equal talent, would we ever know about her writing? No, she would not have had the opportunity to write the way that her brother did. Winkler sort of reads that text against the grain, though. She finds in Woolf's essay some encoded hints that Woolf actually did believe that a woman or women were involved in some way in the production of the plays. And the chapter concludes with a profile of Mark Rylance, the great Shakespearean actor. He was the first artistic director of the restored Globe Theatre in London. Rylance, to the chagrin of many mainstream Shakespeareans, because he's a really, really great actor and knows Shakespeare well, he accepts many possible candidates, including women. His rationale is that each one offers a valuable perspective on the plays and helps him as an actor get a different window onto what the texts are doing. Chapter 10 gives us the Marlowe authorship theory. This is the most fun one because it involves a fake death. In his brief 6-year writing career, Marlowe, who was an exact contemporary of Shakespeare, they were both born in 1564, Marlowe revolutionized English drama with plays like Dr. Faustus and Tamerlane the Great. He was murdered under suspicious circumstances in 1593, just about the time that Shakespeare's career is taking off. They don't blame Shakespeare for the murder, but there is question among certain members of the community here about whether he actually was murdered or did he fake his death. Marlowe seems to have been a spy for Queen Elizabeth's government and seems to have made some powerful enemies. And the theory goes that he needed to fake his death and escape to the continent to preserve his life. But while there, he continued to write plays and publish them under the name of Shakespeare. The chapter also profiles Dr. Rosalind Ross Barber, who is the most prominent contemporary Marlowe proponent, and whose award-winning novel, The Marlowe Papers, traverses, Winkler says, the blurry line between fiction and biography. And then finally, chapter 11 takes its name, negative capability, from a term coined by the Romantic poet John Keats. Keats pointed out Shakespeare's talent for being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So this is the framing device for the last chapter, in which he profiles some prominent contemporary mainstream Shakespeareans. First is Stephen Greenblatt of Harvard, who seems to share Winkler's skepticism of certainty, but in the course of their short 20-minute interview, won't be pinned down to saying he doubts the identity of Shakespeare. Next is Columbia University's James Shapiro, kind of the main villain of the Atlantic affair. Atlantic published a rejoinder by Shapiro. She looks at his correspondence with John Paul Stevens, the Supreme Court Justice, who reached out to him and wrote personal letters. They exchanged correspondence, discussing the authorship question. By this point, Stevens was an Oxfordian. Shapiro was pretty frustrated by the exchange, and Winkler concludes that while Shapiro insisted on certainty, Stevens suggested humility, negative capability. And finally, Harvard's Marjorie Garber. Winkler interviews her and finds her most interested in the works, not in the writer. And Garber refuses to take a stand on the identity of Shakespeare. And by the end of the interview, Winkler is baffled by the mystery of Garber's, what she says, indifference. So I found a lot to like about Shakespeare Was a Woman. Winkler is a skilled writer. She is good at weaving together a mass of historical minutiae into quite an entertaining narrative. She offers some pretty interesting windows into Renaissance culture, the fascination with anagrams, the prevalence of pseudonymous publication, use of pen names or publishing anonymously, and the triumphs of some women writers in the face of some pretty high cultural boundaries to entry into the world of letters. So Mary Sidney and Amelia Bassano get their due, which is really nice to see, whether or not they wrote the works of Shakespeare. The book is most fun, I think, when Winkler is herself on location, sightseeing or interviewing specialists. Her portrait of the Birthplace Museum in Stratford is pretty funny and pretty scathing. She sees it as a kind of a consumerist tourist trap. She calls it a heap of tchotchkes and trinkets. To my mind, the main shortcoming of the book is it generally fails to engage with the substance of mainstream Shakespearean arguments. Shakespeareans have responses to some of these skeptical doubts, but Winkler mostly ignores them, or if she gives them any airtime, it's a sentence at most. So an example, the will. Winkler makes a lot of the fact that the will doesn't mention any books and makes no provision for Shakespeare's manuscripts. She doesn't mention that E.A.J. Honigman and Susan Brock, in their book Playhouse Wills, 1558 to 1642, survey 15 playwrights' wills and find only 3 of those mention books at all. She doesn't acknowledge that the disappearance of Shakespeare's manuscripts is not all that unusual. Giles Dawson and Letitia Kennedy Skipton point out in their book Elizabethan Handwriting, 1500 to 1650, this is a quote, "No manuscript of any play has survived in the autograph of Kidd, Green, Johnson, Chapman, Dekker, Heywood, Marston, Webster, Beaumont, Fletcher, or Ford, to name only the better-known dramatists." So Shakespeare is in good company in not having manuscripts left behind. There's so much focus on the supposed psychology of Shakespearean orthodoxy, the groupthink, religious zealotry, overweening pride, that I think Winkler misses an opportunity to really look at the differences between the reasoning and standards of evidence that the two camps use. So on the left, here's your Stratfordian logic. It runs like this. Number one, though we know less about Shakespeare's creative life than we would like, nevertheless, number two, we have enough external documentary evidence to know that, or to be able to say with confidence that, William Shakespeare was the playwright behind these plays. As historian Ian Mortimer explains, the strongest such evidence is going to be testimonies of people who had firsthand knowledge of the writer and the writing. So an example of that, William Honig, who was the clerk for Edmund Tilney, the master of the king's revels, the person in charge of entertaining the king, he kept a log of all the performances by Shakespeare's company at the royal court in the year 1604 to 05, and in that log, he identifies William Shakespeare as the author of Measure for Measure, The Merchant of Venice, and another one called The Play of Errors, which is almost certainly the Comedy of Errors. Likewise, fellow playwright Ben Jonson, in his sort of private commonplace book, like a journal, describes Shakespeare's characters. He says, "I love the man and do honor his memory on this side of idolatry as much as any." He has both praise and criticism of Shakespeare's works. This seems like pretty good documentary evidence that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. Meanwhile, on the other hand, for Stratfordians, we have no such evidence to support the authorship claims of any other writer. The anti-Stratfordian argument is a different kind of logic. It starts from a different place. The internal evidence from the plays and poems suggests X about the writer's personality, education, and life experiences. Now, X is going to vary depending upon the reader. John Thomas Loney, when he was making his case for Oxford, listed 18 personal characteristics that he inferred from the plays and poems. Those include things like number 3, of intense sensibility, a man apart. Number 10, a man with feudal connections. Number 16, loose and improvident in money matters. Number 17, doubtful and somewhat conflicting in his attitude to women. Now, by contrast, Winkler reads Shakespeare's plays in her original article and finds the women characters kind of protesting at the limitations of their sex, of remarkable female friendships that have no correspondence in the sources that Shakespeare drew on. And so for Winkler, that's evidence that the writer had to have been a woman. Number two, for anti-Stratfordians, the available historical evidence about William Shakespeare of Stratford does not fit this profile. But number three, candidate Y's life does. Therefore, number four, Shakespeare of Stratford must have been a front for candidate Y. So that's the crux, I think, of the disagreement. What counts as evidence when reconstructing the historical past? For mainstream Shakespeareans, they want to see external documentary evidence. Someone from outside the plays attesting to the authorship of William Shakespeare. Anti-Stratfordians don't trust a lot of that evidence. They say that Shakespeare, when he's referred to by other writers, that could be a pseudonym, not the man himself. So they'll point to that internal evidence from the plays, supplemented by some of the encrypted allusions like we saw a couple slides ago to suggest that someone else was the writer. Shakespeareans are going to protest. They'll say, well, yeah, but your psychological profile is going to be biased by your own assumptions and your own experiences, and that the encoded evidence, anagrams and whatnot, are too open to interpretation to be a reliable basis for historical narrative. So I would have liked to have seen Winkler address these crucial differences in the use of evidence and reasoning in a more sustained way. Instead, we get some scattered and provocative suggestions about these differences. She accuses Shakespeareans, on the one hand, of kind of remaining on the surface of the text and refusing to go deeper than that. On the other hand, she does question whether some of the Oxfordian tendencies to see encoded names everywhere is really well-founded. Followers of De Vere often want to see, every time you see the word ever in a Shakespeare text, isn't that a reference to E. Vere, Edward de Vere? So a never writer to an ever reader in the preface to Troilus and Cressida, 1609, could be an E. Vere writer to an E. Vere reader. And Winkler, to her credit, is I think, skeptical of this kind of argumentation. She pays a lot of attention to the different psychological biases that people bring to their beliefs. Confirmation bias, our desire to create a story rather than exist with uncertainty. She addresses Occam's razor, right, that you should not multiply assumptions unnecessarily. But she also asks, is the simplest explanation always the correct one? And that's a valid question. I wish she would go further to ask, like, how do we know when to reject the simpler explanation? When is it helpful to ask questions about what seems to be a settled matter, and when does it actually impede the progress of knowledge? When should you trust the experts, and when should you, do your own research, as the saying goes nowadays? I'd love to see Winkler open up the authorship controversy to these deeper questions. I have a couple more slides, but I think I'm getting short on time, and I want to make, well, okay, so I'll be quick here. Winkler sees the authorship controversy as pretty quintessentially Shakespearean, that there's something uncannily Shakespearean about the authorship question. Mistaken identities abound in Shakespeare. Reputations are false. Appearances are deceptive. Things are not what they seem. So for Winkler, it makes perfect sense that William Shakespeare might not be the person we think he was. The plays often are about that very thing. She sees Viola's disguise in Twelfth Night. She sees Iago's deceptions in Othello as comic and tragic examples of what she says the consequences of being taken in by such illusions. I want to end with a slightly different lesson drawn from Othello about the pitfalls of indirect circumstantial evidence and motivated reasoning. So when Iago first suggests to Othello that Desdemona has been unfaithful to him, Othello demands the ocular proof. He says at the top here, make me to see it. All right, seeing is believing. He wants direct evidence with his own eyes of the infidelity. But he immediately qualifies that. He then goes on to say that he would accept a lower standard of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, or at least so prove it that the probation bear no hinge or loop to hang a doubt on. And I think this is where Othello pounces. Does Othello really want to see Cassio and Desdemona having sex? he asks, would you, the supervisor, it says supervision, but editors usually amend that to supervisor. Would you, the supervisor, the looker on, grossly gape on, behold her topped? It were a tedious difficulty, I think, to bring them to that prospect. Othello is horrified by the entire idea. But yet, Iago says, if imputation and strong circumstances, which lead directly to the door of truth, will give you satisfaction, you might have it. So what are the strong circumstances, the circumstantial evidence that Iago provides? It's a made-up story about Cassio talking in his sleep, misunderstood conversation between Cassio and Bianca, is a stolen handkerchief. These flimsy proofs convince Othello why. Well, one answer is simply that Shakespeare's drawing on some racist stereotypes about Moors being jealous and credulous. If there's a more generous explanation, it might be that Othello, that these proofs are confirming what he's already and always believed about himself, that Desdemona could never really love him because of his age, because of the color of his skin, because of his outsider status in Venice. So he follows this thread of motivated reasoning and thinking that he's walked through the door of truth, and he's not even in the right building. Anti-Stratfordians and Stratfordians alike should take heed. Thank you.